This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel, broadcasting remotely. The pandemic has certainly exacerbated the disparities in our communities. The public health crisis caused more Americans to stay home, and as the temperatures heat up this summer, we're reminded how uncomfortable it can be without air conditioning. But a lot of AC is the last thing our planet needs right now. In 2018, a report by the International Energy Agency predicted the number of air conditioning units worldwide will rise from 1.5 billion today to more than 5 billion by mid-century. How do we respond to a warming planet when heat also affects our health and safety too? You can join our conversation today, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WMPR. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. I want to welcome our guest to the show. Gabrielle Dreyfus joins us on Zoom. She's senior scientist at the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development, also chief scientific advisor for the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, and she co-authored a recent UN report about cooling technology and climate change. Gabrielle, welcome to our show.
Hi, Lucy.
Also with us is Leticia Colon de Mejias, who's an energy policy expert, co-chair of Efficiency for All Connecticut, and she's the co-owner of Energy Efficiency Solutions. Leticia, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So, Gabrielle, I wanted to start with you. When we think about access to air conditioning, we know it has health and safety implications. Can you talk about in recent years how around the globe we've seen serious death and illness due to heat waves?
Yeah, so let me start by providing a little bit of context. The cooling, air conditioning, but also refrigeration is really essential to health and well-being and productivity. So the World Meteorological Organization, for example, recently came out with a report that says about 30% of the world's population is now living in conditions that deliver deadly heat at least 20 days a year. So this is a really significant problem in the world. In the US, on average, more than 600 people die from extreme heat events every year, according to the Centers for Disease Control. So this is, especially in a warming world, a growing concern and really an essential part of our lives, not just to keep us comfortable, but also to keep us productive. I live in Washington, D.C., and I wouldn't be able to do the kind of work on a computer that I do every day if I didn't have access to air conditioning in my house.
Leticia, when we hear those statistics from Gabrielle, it's really alarming. Here in Connecticut, before you started working in the energy efficiency sector, I believe you were in the health field. When we think about the residents in our state who don't have access to air conditioning and how it impacts their health, where do they live?
Well, there are several low-income communities in Connecticut. And I like to look at this in the concept of not just access to cooling, but access to energy. So you can't have an air conditioner without electricity. And in our state, 400,000 households can't afford to keep their lights on. So if we look at it in means of the areas of disparity in our state, we're really looking at areas where the housing is old and inefficient, or they have indoor air quality issues already, and then they have the additional burden of not having access to air conditioning.
In the pandemic, that certainly was exacerbated if you think about the people that have lost their jobs and lost their income, and it's been really hot, and they've been told either to stay home or keep their distance. That's hard to do inside, Leticia, when it's 90 plus degrees in communities, and it really shows the disparities that still remain.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. I think, when you're driving through the areas of poverty, you're seeing people, outside on their stoop because it's hotter in their house than it is outside on a 100-degree day. So again, if that building has never been addressed for thermal boundary issues, that heat is just rising to that top floor. So the tenants on the 5th floor, for example, are going to be in stifling heat. And a fan just is not going to do enough, especially if you have an asthmatic child or an elderly person in that household. Or again, if you're living with an indoor health barrier such as mold, which is going to be increased during, like yesterday was a very warm, damp day in Connecticut. So that's going to exacerbate that and create additional health impacts on that family.
Gabrielle, I mentioned cooling technologies. Obviously, air conditioning is a big one. But talk about what else, when we say cooling technologies, what do we mean and how that is contributing to our warming planet and the use of energy around our globe?
Yeah, so when we're talking about cooling, I'm using that term loosely to cover everything from air conditioning, which is what keeps our homes and businesses and even our cars and transport comfortable. And this actually also includes heat pumps, which are reversible air conditioners that move heat from the outside to the inside of your home, which are very popular, for example, in Europe and are becoming more popular in the US. Then there's the refrigeration, which is really critical to preserving food and medicine. So we have our refrigerators in our houses, but during this time of pandemic, it's important to think of refrigerated cold chains, both for making sure that tests get to labs are preserved correctly, but really important as we think through how vaccines that are being developed are going to be distributed, not just in this country, but around the world. And the third category is industrial cooling. This can be for data centers, which we're all very dependent on right now for our connected world, but also agricultural production and other uses of industrial cooling. And go ahead.
I was just going to say what you said about vaccine development. That's especially an important point when we think about cooling technologies.
Yeah, very much. And I think it's really important to realize that there are a lot of parts of the world that don't have well-developed and reliable vaccine cold chains. And so as the world races both to develop a vaccine, there are efforts looking to make sure that the cooling devices for the vaccines that are going to be developed are better for for energy use and for the climate as well.
When we focus on just air conditioning, what's the percentage in the United States that relies on air conditioning, and what other countries where you see that concentration?
Yeah, so the U.S. is an example where most households, and I think the statistic is on the order of 87% of U.S. households have air conditioners. And this is much more than in a lot of parts of the world. For example, in India, which is a much hotter climate, only about 10% of urban households have access to an air conditioner. We saw in the 90s a really, really rapid rate of growth in air conditioners in China, where they went from similarly low levels to now most homes in China in the cities have an air conditioner. And as a result of this really rapid growth in air conditioning demand, cooling across all those three areas I just described accounts for about 17% of the world's total demand for electricity today. And the electricity demand for air conditioning alone in our homes and businesses could triple by 2050, according to the International Energy Agency.
And when we think about cooling, I had mentioned it's a big contributor to greenhouse gases and climate emissions. Can you talk about, again, how much, and not just the operation, the electricity, but the coolants that are used?
Exactly. So this is why it's really important that as we look to meet the need for cooling, that we take advantage of the fact that we have a lot of much more efficient and climate-friendly technology and designs and policies that we know how to do. And if we don't take advantage of this time to put those in place and get those technologies out there, we run the risk of actually using up most of the remaining carbon budget for staying below 1.5 C just from this sector alone. And that's because cooling both requires a lot of electricity, which right now is mostly powered by fossil fuels like coal and gas that put out a lot of carbon dioxide, but also other short-lived climate forces like methane and black carbon that warm the planet. But they also rely on these coolants, these refrigerants that are mostly man-made gases that are very, very potent greenhouse gases, hundreds to thousands of times stronger than carbon dioxide. The good news is that the technologies that we have in place, that we know exist, if we were to put those out there at scale over the next 40 years, we could avoid between 210 and 460 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions equivalent, which is 48 years of our total emissions globally right now.
You're hearing Gabrielle Dreyfus with us on Zoom. She's senior scientist at the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development. She co-authored a recent UN report about cooling technology and climate change. As we talk about that today, also with us, Leticia Colon de Mejias, energy policy expert and co-chair of Efficiency for All Connecticut. She's co-owner of Energy Efficiency Solutions. You can join our conversation too, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Before I go back to Leticia, you mentioned, Gabrielle, again, the significance of staying below our global temperature, staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius. If it rises, it'll be catastrophic. That might be hard for people to wrap their mind about what that exactly means. When we talk about these places around our planet where you've seen heat waves, if the temperature rises, what that means for specific parts of our globe, and what that means for the residents there.
Yeah, so one of the things that's important to think about is when we talk about 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, these are global average temperature increases. And what we actually experience day to day isn't the global average temperature. And we see a very strong correlation between the additional heat in the system that's adding to that global average temperature, but the frequency and intensity of heat waves. So the Internet Governmental Panel on Climate Change put out a special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius 2 years ago. And one of their conclusions is that if we limit the warming to 1.5 instead of 2 degrees, that could protect around 420 million people from being frequently exposed to extreme heat waves. That's more than the current US population. So it really is important to slow warming now to reduce the number of these extreme, though we're talking about temperature, but there's also humidity, these kind of extreme events that can cause a lot of illness and death.
Leticia, coming back to Connecticut, you mentioned earlier about the fact that our state has a lot of older housing stock, multifamily homes that may not be equipped for not only having central air, but the fact that with our electricity grid and people not being able to afford the high cost of electricity in our state specifically, you work for an energy efficiency company. Can you talk about the funding that residents should have access to for improving efficiency, considering our old housing stock?
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, in Connecticut, we do have the Conservation Load Management Fund, which was put into law by Act 1180. And that fund collects a small bit of money on everybody's electric and gas bills. And then they use those resources to help people reduce their energy consumption and lower that press on the grid that we were just discussing. So when we increase our air conditioning load, we increase the total draw from our state for energy needs. And that in Connecticut is coming from nuclear and gas, essentially. And so that cost of energy, it's a supply and demand calculation. And so the more energy we use, the higher the cost of energy is per kilowatt hour. So because of that, our state was smart enough to create a program called Energize Connecticut that helps people access funds to reduce consumption by doing very simple things in their home. You can call and have an energy assessment. And because of COVID right now, that's free for everyone in Connecticut. They can call Energize Connecticut directly. And then after their energy assessment, they can get things done like air sealing and insulation in their home, again, at very low costs because of this fund that is there to support them. Unfortunately, in our state, we have had 5 times where that fund was raided and that money was taken and dumped into the general fund. So when that kind of stuff happens, what happens is low-income families suffer. Low-income families' cost of energy is about 25% of their household budget. So as we heard earlier in the show, you're talking not just about their cooling needs and their heating needs, you're also talking about refrigeration and cooking. So these are basic needs, access to electricity, air conditioning, and heat. And when the funds get raided, they don't have access to that. Those programs get shut off when we run out of money. So in 2017, when that fund raid happened, about 12,000 families, low income specifically, were not served by the fund. They were not allowed access to programs that would have lowered their energy consumption by air sealing, insulating, and even things as simple as replacing incandescent light bulbs with LED bulbs, which is part of the Energize Connecticut program, can lower someone's electric demand for lighting by 2/3, just replacing their lighting with LEDs. I want to say something about heat pumps. So heat pumps are a really good way to make air conditioning accessible to all types of middle class and low income families. But heat pumps do run on electricity, and they do increase our burden and carbon emissions if that building is not properly air sealed and insulated prior to installing heat pumps. So energy efficient cooling equipment is very important, but if it isn't installed properly in a building that has been addressed, then we're still wasting energy and increasing our climate change burdens.
That's a good lead into my next question, Leticia, for you. Do we have a sense of the scope of how big of an impact, when we think about inefficient home heating and cooling, has on our state's carbon footprint?
Yeah, so we could reduce our carbon footprint in Connecticut in buildings by 30% just by simply following a proven guideline at the Department of Energy in the United States of America in the International IPC report, which says that we should be addressing our old buildings and new construction to ensure they meet building code. So if we build buildings and retrofit buildings to have proper insulation and to be air sealed, have the right sized heating and cooling systems, once those buildings have been addressed, then we're going to have a lower demand on energy overall. Not only does it lower the carbon emissions, but it also will lower the cost of energy because of that supply and demand rule when we bid into ISO New England for our energy purchasing, which we do along with other states. I think that, again, like the technology for heat pumps has come such a long way, and Energize Connecticut is running a pilot where people can get access to incentives and rebates to support their adaptation and adoption of heat pumps. But it does require that that building do a thermal boundary assessment and that the system be properly sized, which is really a benefit to customers because they won't be paying for equipment that they don't need. They'll be paying for the right size system, and it will run more effectively both in the winter and in the summer, if it is, the building is properly addressed for thermal boundary issues, and the system is sized correctly.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. You just heard Leticia Colon de Mejias, an energy policy expert and co-chair of Efficiency for All Connecticut. Also with us, Gabrielle Dreyfus, senior scientist at the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development. She co-authored a recent UN report about cooling technology and climate change. We're talking about that today. And after the break, we're going to continue hearing about the importance of efficient cooling options, the role of renewable energies. You can join us too, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Do you worry about the impact of running AC all day on your energy bill, especially this summer in the pandemic when your budget's tight? Do you think about the impact that all that air conditioning has on greenhouse gas emissions in our planet? You can join our conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. My guests today are Leticia Colon de Mejias, an energy policy expert, co-chair of Efficiency for All Connecticut. She's also the co-owner of Energy Efficiency Solutions. And Gabrielle Dreyfus is with us, senior scientist at the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development, who co-authored a recent UN report about cooling technology and climate change. Gabrielle, when we're talking about efficiency, what role can renewable energies play here?
So renewable energies play a really important role in reducing the greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with producing that electricity. And so we need to pursue installing more renewables and getting those integrated into the grid. One challenge that air conditioning in particular poses, however, is that everyone tends to use their air conditioners at the same time. And so air conditioning is associated with something we call peak load. So the highest electricity demand is usually the hottest part of the day, which isn't necessarily when the sun is shining. So a lot of people run their ACs in the evening to cool things down so that they can sleep better. And so there's a really important consideration when it comes from the cost of integration of renewables to be thinking about the kind of storage requirements, but also improving the efficiency of the air conditioners means you can bring that peak load down and reduce the total capacity that you need to be able to meet that demand.
We're talking about this today because it's also an equity issue. Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. This again is Lucy Nalpathanchel, host of Where We Live. Looks like I lost my connection at home, so now I'm switching over to Zoom. Gabrielle, my question to you was to talk about urban heat islands and how that impacts, people in cities and how that's exacerbated when we think about climate change.
It's a great question, and it relates to something that Letitia has been talking about, which is the strong correlation between vulnerability to heat events and low-income communities. And this is especially important in our cities. So urban heat islands, it's this phenomenon where our cities tend to have a lot more dark pavements and buildings and parking lots that absorb a lot of heat. And so the Climate Central has a great tool where I looked up, and Hartford apparently on average is 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit hotter in the summer than surrounding areas, and up to 19 degrees hotter in some cases. So that you really can get this extra heat concentrated in the cities. And that is exacerbated by people running more air, who have access to air conditioning, running more air conditioning, which rejects heat into the environment. You actually get this vicious cycle where hotter cities, you run more air conditioning, which makes them even hotter. And where you have this correlation is that the hottest parts of the cities often tend to be where the poorest communities live, who have the largest struggle to get access to cooling. So this is a real issue.
Leticia, earlier we talked about the high cost of electricity in our state. In the wintertime, we know that there are programs to help people who are struggling to pay their heating bills. But what happens in the summer with cooling bills?
This is a really great question. So we have great programs in Connecticut that help people from October to April. But come April, we can all turn off their electricity. Because of COVID, our governor was kind enough to pass an executive order that there would be no shutoffs. And so this summer, people have had access to electricity and running water. But normally that isn't the case. Normally come April 1, they could have their energy actually turned off. And like I said, over 400,000 households experience that annually in our state here. But I want to say that, something that was just said is so important about the heat index and the, heat sinks that are happening in our cities. In addition to the heat sinks that are caused by all of those things like dark pavement and buildings, we also have condensed high-rise buildings in urban areas. And so the higher floors on those buildings are hotter than the lower floors. So you've got an additional stacking effect of people being in close quarters. And then with this pandemic, we've really seen that people are stuck at home. Nothing's open. So normally they could go to the library or their school or their YMCA for the summer, and they could be inside a cool area and safe potentially. But because of the COVID experience, people are being forced to stay in their communities and in their homes even. And so they really are experiencing this heat in a much different way this summer. Even look at like restaurants are closed. So normally you could go grab a bite to eat maybe at your local establishment. And right now, again, people are eating outside with social distancing. So as the temperatures are rising, we're really seeing the disparity hit hard in the low income and at-risk communities.
Gabrielle, did you want to add to that? Because again, we're talking about here in our state of Connecticut, but nationwide, we're seeing similar trends.
Yeah, so actually NPR did a study last year that looked at 97 of the most populous US cities and found that in more than 3/4 of those cities, there's this very strong correlation between the higher urban heat island effects and the lower income communities. So this is really an issue across the US. The good news is that there are low cost interventions to help to reduce some of the heat islands. And this includes everything from planting trees to improve shading, which is not only good for cooling things down, it can actually cool by a few degrees, but it also can remove air pollution, has that filtering effect on the air, which is really important for health as well. The other things that you can do are increasing the reflectivity of our pavements and rooftops and walls. There's an organization called the Smart Surfaces Coalitions that's working with cities to get them to adopt some of these really low-cost strategies for tamping down on some of those urban heat island effects.
This is a really interesting time because we are in this pandemic and there is such an emphasis to how do we rebuild our economies after COVID. It's also a jobs opportunity, Leticia, thinking smartly as we move forward.
Yeah, in fact, I was called to Congress last year to talk specifically about climate change and the index to workforce and building efficiency. And one of the things I was able to provide in my testimony was the basic understanding that in 2017, Connecticut had 34,000 energy efficiency jobs in comparison to around 10,000 solar jobs. So investing and expanding energy efficiency and creating local job training programs for these career choices, such as being able to insulate housing, do energy assessments, or install ductless heat pumps that work for both heat and air conditioning, would completely rebuild our economy post-COVID or during COVID, right? So investments in this type of jobs, in fact, in the report that we were just talking about here from the UN, explained that it is one of the highest return on investments and creates 9 to 30 jobs in relationship to other areas per million invested, 9 to 30 jobs, which is literally one of the best return on investments that we can have for rebuilding our economy. In federal legislation, there's a Hopes for Homes bills that would be that is up for discussion in Congress that would allocate money to states to increase job training programs and energy efficiency careers, and really could help rebuild and get people back to work again.
Gabrielle, we mentioned that UN report. I was wondering if you could talk more about, again, this really important time when we're trying to rebuild after COVID.
Yeah, this is exactly a really important point, that investing in making our buildings better, healthier for us, more efficient, does have this huge return in jobs per dollar invested. That's because not only are you paying for the technicians and skilled labor to improve the insulation, to add reflective coatings to roofs, but if you reduce the amount of cooling load, you don't have to spend as much on your air conditioning. That's dollars in a homeowner's pocket that can then go into the economy for other purposes and create other jobs and sustain other jobs that way.
You're hearing Gabrielle Dreyfus again, senior scientist at the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development. She co-authored this recent UN report about cooling technology and climate change. Also with us here on Where We Live on Zoom, Leticia Colon de Mejias, energy policy expert and co-chair of Efficiency for All Connecticut, co-owner of Energy Efficiency Solutions. Before we talk about solutions from a global perspective, Leticia, I did want to go back to this raid by the Connecticut General Assembly back in 2017, taking, I believe, $145 million from efficiency programs to help the state plug deficits. I believe that you were a part of a lawsuit challenging that. What has happened with that situation?
Yeah, it was like 165 million that they swept into the general fund. And that lawsuit was really brought by a group of concerned advocates from many different areas, Save the Sound and myself, and then other contractors that really had to let at least 50 to 75% of their staff go after that funding raid occurred. And Janet Hall in Connecticut, Judge Hall found that she didn't feel that there was a contract between the ratepayer who's paying into the fund and the state of Connecticut to protect their right to accessing those funds. And it went to circuit court, and the circuit court also felt that the ratepayers who pay into the fund don't necessarily deserve access to the fund to help them invest in things like energy reduction, proven energy reduction methods, and improved HVAC or air conditioning. So right now, that is has been decided as something to not be protected. We do have a governor in our state, though, that has pledged to defend the energy efficiency funds and to ensure that they are not rated in the budget. It will be interesting to see, what the budget looks like and whether they make some, what I would call forward-thinking decisions to invest in expanding these career options and expanding training programs and energy efficiency programs so that we can truly address this energy burden. Energy policy is a very complex topic that most people don't think about, but every demand for electricity that we add to our grid raises the cost per kilowatt and the cost of energy overall, which again is a much higher percentage, or 25% of a low income to middle class income's annual budget. And so it's important for us to invest in things equitably, like removing indoor barriers in households so they can access these programs and reduce their energy burdens.
It's something when we talk about the pandemic, we know that despite aid from the federal government and the state of Connecticut, lawmakers are going to have some real challenges before them, Leticia, come the next general session at the beginning of next year. Are you concerned that, again, if the state is really struggling, that commitment that Governor Lamont has said he will make towards energy efficiency programs may not happen?
With the pandemic, I think that it's so important that people understand the connection between health, economics, and even sustainability and climate change as it relates to our energy policy and budgeting decisions. So sometimes we do Band-Aid solutions, right? Like affording people money to pay their energy bills when the same investment, for example, be able to draw down their consumption by 30% and they might be able to pay their own energy bill. So I think that it really comes down to helping our leaders understand that there are ways to meet both our energy, economic, and health goals and still be equitable if we plan these things in a way that address issues at like an order of operations. So, for example, maybe before ensuring everyone has access to an electric vehicle infrastructure, which would increase our demand on electricity, that we would instead first address buildings, which would help health issues, indoor health air quality, sheltering in place, lowering our energy burdens, heat stack effect, and help with the cost of energy, rather than, just for example, again, electric vehicles are lovely things, but, it might be good during a pandemic to ensure that people have a place to shelter safely, especially, again, summer's going to end and winter's going to come and we live in a cold state. So we have to worry about peak load both in winter and in summer.
Gabrielle Dreyfus, I want to go back to you because I want to make sure that we spend some time on solutions from the international community. There are tools, including what's, an amendment to the Montreal Protocol. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so one of the things that is a really positive story from this is we have the technologies. We know how to make our buildings better. We know how to make cooling more efficient. So, for example, for room air conditioners, the average efficiency that people are buying, well, we have units on the market that are 2 or 3 times more efficient already. And in terms of the coolants, we have alternatives that are half or about 100 times better in terms of climate impacts. And we also have a really important policy driver, and that's the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer, which is really one of the most successful environmental treaties we have. I don't know how many people remember that it wasn't long ago that we were worried about the destruction of the stratospheric ozone layer, which would have led to a number of skin cancers and cataracts and impacts on agricultural production, because that's the layer that protects us from the harmful solar rays. Well, the Montreal Protocol was agreed in 1987, and it has, through a start and strengthen approach, not only put the ozone layer on a path to recovery, but because the chemicals that were destroying the ozone layer, these man-made chlorofluorocarbons and hydrochlorofluorocarbons, they were not only destroying the ozone layer, but they're super powerful greenhouse gases. The Montreal Protocol by itself, through and the bans that were put in place as people were learning about the harms of these chemicals has avoided the amount of warming that we are seeing from CO2 today. So it's really a successful treaty. And in 2016, you mentioned the Kigali Amendment. This treaty that has been strengthened and amended 5 times already in the past, the countries said, okay, well, the replacement to those ozone depleting chemicals, the hydrofluorocarbons that aren't ozone depleting, are still very strong greenhouse gases. So we're going to take it upon ourselves now to transition away from these to more climate-friendly alternatives. And at the same time, because this treaty, by changing the coolants, drives industry to redesign all of the air conditioners and refrigerators, we want them to deliberately make that transition, improve the efficiency of that equipment as well. In the past, there have been these efficiency improvements catalyzed by the Montreal Protocol, but this is the first time that there's a really deliberate effort.
And has the U.S. signed this Kigali Amendment, or do you anticipate it will?
Yeah, so the U.S. was one of the countries. It was a consensus agreement on the Kigali Amendment in 2016, and one of the steps is then to get it ratified and implemented in the U.S. And the U.S. industry, which is a major player, is driving this process right now. And they really want this because it's great for U.S. jobs. I think they had a study that said something like 33,000 U.S. jobs would come from ratification. So ratification will happen. And actually, states are already moving ahead. California has put in place a policy. And I think that there was a discussion, and Connecticut was also working on a policy that would start the phase down process of these super polluting hydrofluorocarbons, consistent with the Kigali Amendment.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank Gabrielle Dreyfus for joining us on Zoom, senior scientist at the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development. We'll share out that recent UN report that you co-authored about cooling technology and climate change on our website, wnpr.org/wherewelive. Gabrielle, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Leticia Colon de Mejias will stay with us. She's an energy policy expert and co-chair of Efficiency for All Connecticut, as we continue to talk about this importance of equity when we think about cooling technologies. Also, environmental justice. We're going to hear from a Connecticut lawmaker about how the General Assembly has responded to these issues. You can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel, broadcasting remotely. Hopefully that issue has been resolved and you can all hear me. So we wanted to talk about how the Connecticut General Assembly is responding to environmental justice issues. So joining us now by phone is State Representative Geraldo Reyes Jr. He represents Waterbury. He's also Deputy Majority Leader and Vice Chair of the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus in the Connecticut General Assembly. Representative Reyes, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. Good morning, everybody.
We know it's been a long night for you. Just to update our listeners briefly, I believe the Police Accountability Bill, has that been passed by the State House?
We just finished passing the unamended version, the bill as it was intended to be, and it just passed maybe 35 minutes ago. So in the midst of all this exhaustion, I'm also elated.
So that moves on to the Senate now.
Moves on to the Senate next, and with our hopes is that it'll get to the governor and he'll sign it.
Well, thank you for that quick update. We wanted to have you on the show today to talk about how the state passed an environmental justice law more than a decade ago. You have legislation that would update the law. So what has happened in the last decade? Why is it necessary to update the law, especially for your community in Waterbury?
So thank you very much for that question. So the environmental justice bill, which is the law of the state of Connecticut, was I believe was introduced and by State Representative Jack Hennessy from Bridgeport, and I believe he was one of the leaders of it. But the bill has not been kind of revised or tweaked. And really, what really got myself and a few legislators from the greater Waterbury area interested in this was the fact that we actually challenged the environmental justice law in Waterbury. We had a situation where the community and led by a bunch of activists and myself and some other people that have a vested interest in a particular area, which is the south end of Waterbury. We believe that we had enough pollutants there and that we had already had enough bad air quality. You know, there are nights like this week that we've had with the waste treatment plants. You have some foul air down there. You have the dog pound down there. There's an asphalt plant down there. There's gas tanks down there. I believe last count was 16 or 17 pollutant entities down there. And it was just a whole bunch of us that really dug in and said, you know what, enough is enough. It's too much down here. Compounded by the fact that we knew that we had some of the worst air quality in the Northeast and possibly the whole Eastern Seaboard. And then compounded by the fact that we knew that the asthma rate for that particular area and the zip code 06706 was astronomically high. So connecting all those dots told us that if there was something that we could fight for, or if it didn't exist, we needed to create it. And we found the environmental justice law. We challenged it. We lost an appeal with the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. And not this session, but the session before, I introduced a bill to put a little muscle and a little teeth behind the environmental justice law that's already on the books. And we were able to pass it out of the environmental committee, and it passed out of the House very favorably with bipartisan support. But unfortunately for all of us, the bill never got called in the Senate. So even though we were fighting to get it passed on the last night of the session, not this one here, not 2020, not the one that just finished, but 2019. Mm-hmm. So our hopes is that where we are today was the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus made environmental justice one of its 6 priority bills for the special session. And it has since obviously been sliced off because the 4 bills that ran in the special session were the insulin bill, the telehealth, medical, obviously the absentee ballot voting, and the police accountability bill. So.
Representative Reyes, when we think about, again, this bill to update the environmental justice law that was passed more than a decade ago, it's especially important now when you think about, again, how environmental injustice issues disproportionately impact urban communities of color. It fits into this broader conversation about equity during a pandemic.
Honestly, that, you know what, had I ran that bill, the bill that we ran in 19 that didn't get called in the Senate that passed, had that been this year, I believe it would have passed, and I think it would have passed with bipartisan support. Mm-hmm. We clearly seen the racial and economic inequalities that exist in our country and state, and the BPRC has been dedicated to ensuring that the special session, which is the one that just have, if not that, then we are committed to running this particular bill, because it is very important due to the fact that their disparities and the gaps are so large that we have a commitment to run this bill in September.
Leticia,
so it's not done yet.
Leticia Colon de Mejias is also with us, and I know that you know Leticia. When you hear Representative Reyes talking about this priority and the fact that this law needs to be updated to help communities of color, especially in our state, what would you like to see come this general session coming up?
You know, I'm really proud of Representative Reyes, and I really enjoy working with him and some other reps in the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus. I think that there's been a new focus on environmental justice because of Rep. Reyes's work. And definitely Connecticut needs a focus on environmental justice. During this pandemic, the environmental justice issues have really been expanded and changed. And as climate change becomes a more pressing issue, and as the heat index rises, or we deal with issues like Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, where people had no access to electricity due to storms and couldn't keep their like diabetic medications cold or had nowhere to shelter in a heat crisis. I think that these environmental justice laws absolutely need to have teeth, and we really need to be demanding transparency and accountability in the way our state systems work to support the residents of Connecticut.
Representative Reyes, I wanted to go back to something we brought up earlier, and that was the legislature, the state of Connecticut's raid on energy efficient funds back in 2017, and then again. When we think about how other states have prioritized energy efficiency, you can just look to the state of Vermont as an example, and then you have a state of Connecticut where you have programs like this, but then when there are difficulties in filling budgets and getting them back into the black, the state has raided these programs. I mean, how do we keep that from happening again?
It's a great question. And first of all, I'd also like to say good morning to Ms. Letitia. She's a strong supporter of our environmental group here. So thank you for your advocacy as well. That whole time before the funds were raided in 17, Ms. Letitia Mejia's spoke with the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus. We tried everything we could. We wrote letters in support not to do it. It was unfortunate that the gap that they were trying to fill in the budget was so large. And we have to be very careful because the gap is quite large right now again. Mm-hmm. And, you asked a great question. And I think that my expectation is that we're going to get a lot more support from Governor Lamont as he's looking at alternatives to what's happening here in Hartford with their own trash plan and so forth. So he's actually become more, if you will, more versed and involved in the environmental justice bill. He's been a big supporter, and I think that you asked me how. I think that it starts with leadership. I think if we can get Governor Lamont on board to support these particular initiatives, that not to raid these funds again.
Leticia, I want to just go back to you again. Representative Reyes has been a partner in this, but are you confident that the state will take a better approach in the future as this issue continues to weigh on our communities?
Yes, I think that Governor Lamont is a very critical piece to this, as is the Department of Energy and Environmental Protections. We have a new administration there as well. It is very critical that our state government, both our governor and the leaders, understand that the nexus between our economy, our energy demands, and our health.
Well, I want to thank Leticia Colonda Mejias for joining us here on Where We Live. She's an energy policy expert and co-chair of Efficiency for All Connecticut. Leticia, thank you. Representative Reyes, thank you also for calling in today. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Ms. Leticia, have a great day, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Today's show was produced by Carmen Baskoff. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. You can learn more about the show. Just download us on your favorite podcast app. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We hope you have a great weekend.